Thank you to the organizers for organizing and for inviting me as well. I think I join others in having written to Abdurrahman, asking how on earth am I going to contribute to this conference. But I think my approach today is to offer some of my research and then begin to think about how my research might have some kind of something to contribute to the conversation of Islamic political theology. So my presentation is titled Besieged Life. And besieged life is a concept that I'm trying to develop. And it comes out of my PhD research in which I attempt to understand how young Muslim women between the ages of 12 and 18 are devitalized as tawhidic subjects, what I'm calling tawhidic subjects, and they're remade as liberal Muslim women in the context of anti-Muslim racism. Now, I'm really interested in approaching anti-Muslim racism, obviously, through concepts of racism, and I'm interested in conceptualizations of racism as the management of populations through death. And I'm understanding the context that young Muslim women experience their lives as a context that has created the conditions for both their physical and spiritual death. And so it's in this context that I'm trying to understand their experiences, and it's by approaching this context in this way that I'm trying to understand their experiences of racialization and how they're responding to racialization. But I'm not simply interested in their experiences and what we can, how we can document these experiences, but I'm also interested in developing an understanding of this human ontology that is created by anti-Muslim racism that is creating the conditions for the death of Muslim life. And so besieged life then is my attempt to begin this process of thinking about what is this biopolitical subject that is caught in this context at the moment, where death is a very near possibility. So my conceptualization of besieged life that I'm going to share with you today is that it's a figure that faces death on two fronts, a spiritual front and a physical front. There's much more that I could share with you today about how I'm understanding besieged life, but I'm going to focus on this element today. And when Julian was speaking, I actually decided to change the order of my presentation. So I'm going to go back and forth. I'm going to actually start with my research, right? So my research is really interested in the counter-extremism context created in the UK by Prevent. Specifically, how Prevent tries to create a moderate Islam and how it tries then to create new forms of political subjectivities, right, that are deemed to be less dangerous to the state. But my understanding of these political subjectivities that are deemed to be less threatening to the state is that they are also religious subjectivities, right? There are particular religious subjectivities that have been marked by the counter-terror and counter-extremism state as being those subjectivities that pose the challenge, right, of security. And so that's the context that I'm locating these young Muslim women in, okay? Now, very quickly, my research was qualitative in nature. I was very fortunate to be able to work with a large number of Muslim women between the ages of 12 and 18. Even though it was a qualitative project, I had about 70 participants. I conducted about 132 interviews, focus group discussions, and the joke behind that is, you know, I was taking care of a small baby at that time, my own baby, and I sort of did as many interviews, or almost as many interviews as diapers that I changed, but not quite. And I was able to set up a leadership program for Muslim women, again, between the ages of 12 and 18, so young Muslim women. And the idea was to embed, community building, female capacity building with empirical research. Okay, so amongst my many findings, the findings that I want to focus on today are that my participants, through their everyday experiences, found themselves being racialized as imperiled, one, and two, they tried to avoid their racialization as imperiled, okay? Hopefully very easy to hold on to because I'm going to carry these findings through the presentation. One, they're racialized as imperiled, and two, they tried to avoid their racialization. What do I mean by imperiled? I thank Amina and I thank Johanna for laying down some of the conceptual grounding for this presentation, which is, the imperiled Muslim woman, she's this knowledge system in which Muslim women are only ever knowable as a victim of Muslim misogyny, Islamic patriarchy. She's a victim who has no agency, voice, rights, or freedom, and she's a victim of honor killings, FGM, forced arranged child cousin, terrorist marriages, forced veiling, so on and so forth. Okay, so we know who the imperiled Muslim woman is, and so when I say that my participants found themselves racialized as imperiled, this is what I'm referring to. Okay, so focusing then on my first, or the first finding that I want to focus on here today, young British Muslim women are racialized as imperiled. They were racialized through everyday encounters of being physically immobilized, uneducable, backwards, lacking individual choice, subjectivity, and beauty, so on and so forth. Okay. Those were my findings that led me to conclude they're being racialized as imperiled. Now, how am I understanding racialization? Well, for me, the outcomes of racialization are, lack of access to education, lack of access to employment, lack of access to health and healthcare, lack of access to dignified housing. Those are the material outcomes of racialization. Now, oftentimes we look at lack of access to education, employment, health, and healthcare as exclusion, as social isolation, as discrimination. But in my project, I'm actually understanding lack of access to education, healthcare, housing as exposure to physical death, right? Because the end game of lack of access to education, housing, employment, health, and healthcare is this vulnerability to premature death. And this is Ruth Gilmore Wilson's definition of racism. So, to summarize then this slide, young Muslim women are racialized as imperiled, and I'm approaching this racialization thus as locating young Muslim women in a context where they're exposed to physical death, or they're exposed to premature death. Okay, second finding. Young British Muslim women are racialized as imperiled, and now they wish to avoid their racialization. Okay, very simply, they don't want to be taken as imperiled, okay? Now, what do? In my research, they vocalize that they didn't choose to wear the hijab because they didn't want to be known as imperiled. They reduced the size of the hijab, they disassociated the hijab from its religious meanings, and they took different measures to demonstrate to their peers that they're not imperiled, okay? Now, some of the common approaches to understanding Muslim women's negotiations of anti-Muslim racism or their experiences of racialization, there are many here. Double consciousness, ruptural geopolitics, management of the self, resistance, resignification, politics of belonging, so on and so forth. In my project, I don't use any of those frameworks. I approach young British Muslim women's efforts to avoid the racialization as imperiled through Judith Butler's framework of subjection, right? And subjection is, coming from Foucault's idea of subjectification, is this idea of being produced through power. And so because I take the imperiled Muslim woman as this knowledge system, right? Racial knowledge, I therefore take the imperiled Muslim woman as a technique of power. And so what's happening, therefore, for me with these young British Muslim women is that new forms of religious subjectivity are being produced, right? They're not simply negotiating, they're not simply navigating, they're not simply managing their self. They're being made through this knowledge system of the imperiled Muslim woman. And so I see the expression, their efforts to avoid their racialization as imperiled, therefore, as an expression of a new kind of religious subjectivity that interrupts their being and becoming religious subjects. So my understanding of these young girls is that they come from very religious families, and they themselves want to exist in this world as tawhidic subjects, right? And so when they encounter these kinds of, when they encounter the imperiled Muslim woman in their daily life, and they are unable to exist the way they wish to as a tawhidic subject, then it disrupts their religious subjectification, right? And so this subjection now, I'm going so far as to suggest that it indicates a kind of spiritual death or a kind of devitalization of their tawhidic subjectivity. For me, death doesn't have to refer to outright killing or elimination, right? And here I'm drawing on Jasper Poir's work, I'm drawing on Gracie Hong's work. Death in their work can also refer to this kind of incorporation or assimilation into a dominant culture. And so this is why I am approaching young Muslim women's efforts to avoid their racialization as imperiled as a form of subjection and therefore a kind of spiritual death and devitalization. Okay. And so this slide just repeats what I was essentially saying, which is that these young Muslim women, they find themselves subjected. Okay, they're now good Muslim women. They approximate these liberal models of religiosity and citizenship, and they've been remade and in the process devitalized in their efforts to be in this world as a particular religious subject. Okay, so that's my research. Okay, young Muslim women are imperiled, or they find themselves imperiled, or sorry, they find themselves racialized as imperiled. They try to avoid their racialization. I'm understanding their racialization as locating them in a context of physical death or exposure to premature death, and I'm interpreting their subjection as liberal Muslim women, as their location within a context of premature or slow spiritual death. Okay. So now this brings me to theorizing besieged life. Okay? This is how I'm understanding besieged life. It's this biopolitical figure, thus, who experiences death on two fronts, a spiritual death and a physical death. And the spiritual death and the physical death don't have to be immediate, but they are protracted, they are premature. But the end game essentially is this kind of devitalization, this enervation of a life force, both spiritual and physical. Now, I locate besieged life in conversation with other biopolitical figures: bare life, habeas viscus, flesh, precarious life, death-bound subject, and so on and so forth. And I will go through them very quickly. How much time do I have? 5 minutes only. Okay, so I will go through them very, very quickly. And I will sort of compare how I am understanding besieged life in relation to these existing biopolitical figures. So, okay, so we have bare life, which is Agamben's term. And bare life refers to this life that has been stripped of its political personhood through a suspension of the juridical order. It's therefore located outside of the juridical order in the space of exception, and it can be killed without being counted as a homicide. That's bare life. Okay, moving on. Habeas viscus, this is Alexander Wahelia's term, and he challenges Agamben's notion of bare life. He approaches the ontology, the racial ontology of this figure that can be killed through Hortense Spiller's notion of flesh, and he chides Agamben for assuming that there is this kind of racelessness that precedes life, and he challenges this idea that all life is equivalently homosacerable, right? So that's habeas viscus. Flesh, Hortense Spiller's term, and for her, flesh is it is what precedes the body And it is produced through violence, through predation, through displacement, through enslavement, through so on and so forth. And then you have precarious life, which is Judith Butler's term, and for her, precarious life refers to the precarity of life in general. It is vulnerable to death by its very nature of existence. She does acknowledge that, the precarity of some is increased, or, the precarity of some takes place through this ungrievability of their death, and she does acknowledge that, some humans are not regarded as human, and therefore their lives are killable lives. However, she's quite quiet on race and racialization. She doesn't explicitly say, these are the assemblages, racializing assemblages that make a life vulnerable to death. And so that's the critique of precarious life. Finally, you have that death-bound subject, which is this life whose subjectivity is produced in relation to death. And so it escapes, or its subjectivity is made in efforts to avoid death itself. So I'm thinking about now besieged life in relation to these biopolitical figures. And my immediate evaluation is that death here is understood primarily as the physical dying of the body and not in terms of spiritual death. And so the limitation thus of these biopolitical figures is that it doesn't capture the life that experiences a spiritual death in the way the Muslim life does, right? It doesn't capture the fact that you have this political subject, or you have this Muslim subject that faces not only spiritual death, but also physical death through racialization. And it, for example, habeas fiscus, this concept, it doesn't capture this fact that Muslims are not racialized through, phenotype, but, racialized through, value systems, civilizational logics, cultural logics, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, what I'm trying to say is that we need this concept of besieged life because it allows us to talk about a subject that faces both physical and spiritual death. And it's not just a life that simply faces these two forms of death, but it's a life that escapes death through death. It's a life that faces the dilemma of dying and dying. In other words, to escape spiritual death and devitalization, it has to expose itself to physical death, or to escape physical death, it exposes itself to spiritual death. Now, there's much more I can say about besieged life, but I only wanted to focus on the bind that it finds itself in, which is between death and death. Now, implications for Islamic political theology. This is the part that I was dreading for a long time, trying to figure out how this works, but I've been thinking, and that's the important part, and I think that's why I agreed to come here, is because it made me think in a way or on a question that I wasn't thinking about at all. Discourse as a Muslim woman, I don't see them as representation, I don't see them as stereotypes, I don't see them as narratives, I see them as, techniques of power. In other words, they produce different kinds of subjectivities, right? Following Foucault's work on subjectification, Butler's work on subjection, racial knowledge produces racial subjects and animates racial subjectivities, including religious subjectivities of religious subjects who are racialized. And so these discourses are then modalities of secular governance, right? They remake religious subjectivities, they make them compliant with liberal political rule, and they point to the continuing relationship between politics and religion, right? So I'll stop here. Okay.